It is currently 9 o'clock by my laptop and by the clock tower chiming outside my window. And since I'm chairing the first 3 sessions, the morning session, let me go ahead and introduce our first talk of the day. And I just need my schedule for that. 9 a.m. We have Leah Flax from Tidewater Community College. Leah, are you all set?
I am totally ready. Are you ready for me?
I'm all set.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so today I'm going to be, first of all, let me say thank you for having me here and listening to this. The only thing I think I love as much as my physics classes is talking about my physics classes. So today I want to talk about something called PHYSANIC or physics panic. So PHYSANIC is just what it sounds like, which is physics panic. I was actually with a really successful surgeon last night, and his wife, who is a very successful MD at CHKD, and they asked me what I did, and as soon as I said I'm a physics teacher, you could just see their face drop. And that's not what we want when our students leave our classes. We want them to, like, their eyes to just light up and say, oh, that was one of my favorite classes. So how do we avoid physics panic? So I'm going to talk about what we should not do in our classrooms, what we should do in our classrooms, and then knowing our own boundaries. So the first thing, and I might not get through all of this, but I did make some notes for those of you that are interested in this topic at the end. So initially, I'm always surprised as to why people think physics courses, even the really high level ones, have to be so serious. And we can avoid this seriousness with the smallest things, like a little anecdote. Like, for example, I love Star Trek. So I'll just throw Star Trek things in there as a way to try and connect with my students. And most students like Star Wars, for example. So we can have a little bit of banter about that. Just having a general excitement about your class. And if you're really adventurous, some awesome demos. Other things not to do. Probably one of the worst things in my experience that we can do is single a student out. Always pairing them up or even making larger groups is a way to avoid that, like, 10 years down the road drop in their face when someone starts talking about a physics class. The next thing is a little bit controversial probably, but needing a huge curve is a source of a lot of anxiety for students. So, you know, if your highest grade is an 80, all right, I understand that. But if your highest grade is a 46, you might want to think about, was that test too hard? And what is that doing to the mental health of our students, especially in such a hard time right now? Another thing not to do, assume we know what's going on. If a student falls asleep in your class, if the whole class falls asleep, then maybe there's a general problem. But if one student falls asleep, maybe don't assume what's happening with them. And I wouldn't ever suggest getting, invasive in trying to know what's happening in their lives, but it's always nice to say, hey, what's going on? I noticed you were really tired in class. Here's another thing to think about, and there was a really great article in, trying to remember. I can give you the link if you all are interested. National Geographic just recently did a great article about glorifying racist scientists, specifically Nobel Prize winners. This is just something that can make people in your class uncomfortable, so just being aware of that. Ignoring small successes. This is so important. You don't want to ignore the small successes of your students, because you could take one little tiny success and turn that into so much confidence. And one of the things that I think we do as adults or teachers is when we give a compliment to a student, we make it like very general a lot of the time. So we might say, you are so good at this physics class, or you are so good at lab. That's something that could maybe later be taken away from them. If we're really, really specific about what they've done well, nobody can take that one thing away or that success away. So for example, I know this part of lab is really, really difficult. And I noticed that you breezed right through that, and everything you typed in was exactly what you were supposed to do in Excel. That you did a really great job on that. You don't ever want to be oblivious to the mood of your class. If the whole, watch the vibe of your class the whole time, especially during lab. I cannot tell you how many students I preemptively caught before a panic, before they just lose the whole lab and are unsuccessful, by saying, hey, what's going on here? Are you doing all right? And I get letter after letter after letter from students saying, hey, that time that you stopped and noticed that I was having a hard time, I haven't really had an adult do that before. So that can be something really special. What we should do in our classroom, so maybe some happier stuff here. Names should absolutely always be correct. When you are speaking to a student and you use a name, it should be pronounced correctly. Pronouns should always be correct. This kind of goes into the next point, which is knowing generational differences. Younger people have a different relationship with pronouns than we might as, their teachers. But a quick suggestion I have for always making sure names are correct, as long as you're not in a giant lecture hall, would be to go around the room and instead of calling attendance, if you take attendance, or trying to guess on people's names, have them pronounce their name for you. Don't assume a pronunciation if it's not a name that you're familiar with. And if you are not comfortable with that name, get comfortable with it, especially if it's a small classroom. Teaching the students how to self-advocate. One of the things that I do to get them more comfortable and less panicked in class is I always have them, especially in the first classes and first labs, ask me a question for points. So you ask me a question during a test. This wouldn't obviously work for a large lecture hall, but if you have a smaller class or a smaller lab, have them ask you a question. A lot of them think they just can't ask questions. They feel really intimidated, and saying, hey, not only can you ask me questions, but I'm going to reward you for that if you do, can really help students out, whether it may, it could be as simple as a language barrier where they don't understand what one of the words mean on a test. And this could be a really, really successful student if they took the time and weren't intimidated to ask you, hey, what does that mean? Maybe they would have done really, really well because they get the concept, but the question needed to be worded a little bit differently for them. Being aware that there are neurodivergent students that you may need to do things differently for, and maybe think about that ahead of time. Another thing that I always like to do is hand over the notes ahead of time. This is something that maybe comes with more experience because you might not have the notes right away. You might be making the class as you are teaching the class. But I don't know if any of you have recently been in a situation where you were taking a physics course or
Excuse me, Leah, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, it looks like everybody got muted there for a second, including me. All right, let's see. Where was I? Oh, I kind of skipped over generational differences. So I'm glad that I'm glad I got muted there. All right, let's see.
You had just finished the slide when you got muted.
So where was I when I got?
You were going to the next. Yes, you were there.
Oh yeah, preparing. Yeah. So I do want to quickly say, be aware of generational differences. There are certain things, maybe every 10 years, go ahead and learn about different generations that are upcoming, so that you make sure there's not a crazy misunderstanding. Preparing notes ahead of time. This is a huge stress reliever, Another thing that I do in my class is in place of quizzes, we play games. And this, you can make that part of their grade and worth points. And if anyone has questions about that, I'm happy to discuss it. I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit because we just have a little bit of time, but prepare for types of, different types of students, whether they are special needs students, students that may have some sort of PTSD, students that can't physically do something. And as you are prepping your course, think about how could I make this better for someone that can't see what I'm doing or can't hear what I'm saying. One of the things, a specific example that I always, I do a lot of tossing things around in the classroom, and we live in a big military area. So that's not always great for everyone in the class. It can be scary to have something thrown at you. Learn from other teachers. So just because we're short on time, I'm going to let you all read through this later. I can send it in if you're interested. But a huge thing is learning from more experienced or just other teachers at your school. I highly suggest watching other people's courses and how they teach their courses. And then lastly, know your own boundaries with this stuff. You cannot fix everything. Know well what your school has to offer for help for students that you can't provide, whether it's a computer or more mental health support. You don't have unlimited time, and you don't want to feel ever like you're being taken advantage of, because then you're not going to be great at helping everyone else. And lastly, you're going to mess up sometimes, and it's okay to apologize to your class. I've done so myself when I accidentally realized I had singled some people out, and I made a general apology. Students are always kind of surprised when teachers apologize, but I think that we should be more comfortable with that. And it allows for a more just inclusive, student-friendly classroom. And all of these topics, we could go through each individual point for hours probably, but we only had a little bit of time. So now I want to stop and say, are there any questions about anything? Oh, I have a question about getting the link to that article. I actually have it pulled up because I was checking it out this morning. So let me put that. I'll just put that in the chat, in the general chat.
If I may, I had a question about, I think you had an item there that said how to grade for a bell curve.
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. So this is such a huge thing. When students are getting 45s as the highest score on a test, that can be something that we did, or maybe we missed something when we were teaching. So I think that if you have the opportunity to talk to other teachers and find what is an appropriate level to test at based on what you're teaching, you can get much closer to a bell curve where you have the higher grades, hopefully at like, maybe not 100, but like a 95. And then, a lot of the grades at maybe a B or C, but you don't have the huge drop in general scores. And I think that comes with experience or going to other teachers and finding what's appropriate to put on a test and what might be too much, because then you have to create the bell curve or something like that. And if we can do that beforehand with the test, as opposed to making the highest grade a 30, then we can prevent a lot of stress.
It looks like we have a couple of hands up, and we do, I think, have a little flex time to take some questions. Rachel, I saw I had a hand up.
Yes,
Tim did too.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that talk. Those are some great tips and suggestions. I was wondering if you could talk about the types of games that you play.
Oh my gosh. So I try and make everything that would be a quiz into a game. So if I want to give a quiz on understanding the relationship between wavelength, frequency, period, energy, if we're talking about light as a particle and a wave, instead of saying, asking questions on that and giving that as a quiz to make sure they know it, I will do an anonymous poll. Probably a lot of you have learned how to use anonymous polling. That way everybody's answering and I can see in general what people know and what they don't know. And I find it easiest to, because these points are kind of a smaller part of their grade, just trust them that they are going to keep track of these points themselves, and that takes it off of me. So I'm not grading quizzes. They are responsible for the entire semester or year, keeping track of their own points, the date, the points they got, and then they're not scared to answer questions, and you don't have the stress of a quiz. So I literally make anything into a game with polling. Yes, I think someone else had a question.
Yeah, that would be me. I struggle with having students who might not have as strong a math background,
Yes.
willing to admit that they don't and ask for help. Do you have
Yes.
strategies to get them to actually be able to tell us that they are having trouble with a particular concept and how to get them to get the help that they need?
This is such a great question, and it's actually a question that I asked recently, which is why I included it in the notes in this PowerPoint. So a big, huge problem of physics stress is not having the basic math that they need to be in our class, or having the prerequisite and then not being familiar and comfortable with it after a certain amount of time. So one of the best solutions that we came up with when having a discussion about this was, and this is something that I never do, and I'm going to start doing it, just having like an initial, at the very, maybe not the first class, but maybe at the second class, handing out, and this might be a little stressful at first, but sometimes we have to have a little stress to avoid it later, handing out kind of a math quiz. And I really don't like doing math. I do like doing math. I don't love doing quizzes or anything for a grade, and it doesn't necessarily need to be for a grade. It's just so we can see what they know and then kind of say, you need help in this. Forcing them to we can't ever force them to do anything, but getting them to get help is a whole nother story. But we can kind of pick out who might not be ready. And we can give them, I always suggest, I have a list already of math links for YouTube resources. Go on YouTube, here's the links, here's your review. So you can either say, hey, I might need to spend some more time before I'm in this course, or I'm going to review the math.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope we can follow up informally with some conversation about this during some of the breaks, because this is a good topic.